Welcome again to another episode of Fitness Facts. I'm Dr. Jordan Taylor, the Undergraduate Exercise Science Program Director and Associate Teaching Professor here at the University of Kansas. And on today's episode, we will be discussing carbohydrate and performance, practical recommendations before, during, and after exercise. This is the third video in a series. There's two other videos I did on carbohydrates, so make sure and go back and watch those if you want a full understanding. Where are we going with this episode? So brief overview here. We're going to talk first about carbohydrate and performance and the history of research in the field related to that. The effects of exercise on carbohydrate stores, what happens when you exercise to your stored glycogen and the glucose in your blood. We'll talk about a method that's often used by aerobic endurance athletes, carbohydrate loading. There's actually a couple different ways that that's more commonly done. We're going to get into discussing the pros and cons of carbohydrate loading and kind of what just the basic current recommendations are for that. We'll discuss daily carbohydrate recommendations, carbohydrate recommendations before exercise, during exercise, and after exercise. So let's talk about the research here on carbohydrates and their importance in performance. So the role of carbohydrate in exercise has been a topic of interest since 1925. So back in 1925, Gordon and colleagues, they demonstrated that the ingestion of a glucose candy, right, simple sugar glucose, during a marathon allowed runners to complete their task in better condition, right? So again, we know now that glucose is a fuel source for working muscles, along with glycogen that's stored there. 1960s, muscle biopsies. So taking a muscle out, a chunk of muscle out and analyzing it, conducting those muscle biopsies enhanced the understanding of muscle glycogen, how it's stored there, and then how carbohydrate loading, eating a bunch of carbohydrates, high carbohydrate diets in the days leading up to, say, like a marathon, could help you to pack more and store more glycogen in your muscles, right? So you had more of that fuel source available to fuel the marathon that you're going to run in. In the 1980s, there was an increasing number of studies showing the ergogenic, you might say, what's ergogenic? That's performance enhancing effects of carbohydrate ingestion during prolonged exercise, right? So the importance of ingesting carbohydrate during exercise so that you did not fatigue too soon, or that so you could maintain a faster race pace, things like that. And then in 2004, the benefit of ingesting multiple forms of carbohydrate was observed. So, you know that carbohydrates exist in different forms. Studies demonstrated an increase in carbohydrate oxidation rates. So you're more efficiently burning carbs here at a faster rate when consuming multiple forms in a beverage, such as a sports drink. So glucose, fructose, and sucrose. That had a bit better impact on performance than, say, just trying to consume one form of carbohydrate. A study by Carter and colleagues demonstrated, this is interesting, that just rinsing the mouth with carbohydrates during exercise improved performance during a 1-hour cycling time trial. So, you know, it's not like they were swallowing carbohydrates and then they were being stored in the liver, entering the blood as glucose, or being stored in muscle. Just rinsing the mouth with carbohydrates and spitting it out several times throughout exercise was shown to improve performance. Okay, and they think the mechanism responsible for that was that the improvement in exercise performance with mouth rinsing appeared to involve an increase in central drive or motivation rather than having any metabolic cause, because the carbohydrate wasn't getting into the body because you were spitting it out, so there's no metabolism of it. However, there may have been just receptors in the mouth that basically relayed that information to the brain and the central nervous system. And in the brain, just sensing carbohydrates in the mouth caused what are called reward pathways to be activated in the brain. So the reward pathways, these are pathways that produce dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter in the brain. And by producing more dopamine, you feel more motivated, right? So more motivated to continue exercising, continue on that long that long 1 hour cycling time trial. So again, kind of an interesting study. And this is just kind of a brief overview of the history of carbohydrate and performance research. All right, let's look at the effect now of exercise on carbohydrate stores. So at rest and during exercise, the liver has to produce glucose. It has to release it in the blood to maintain our blood glucose concentration. And we want to try to maintain that blood glucose concentration around approximately 100 milligrams per deciliter, okay? Liver glycogen declines overnight to maintain blood glucose. Why does the level of glycogen in the liver decline overnight? Well, we're not eating, we're fasting overnight. So to maintain blood glucose, the liver is going to break down glycogen and release that glucose into the blood. And then we have that glucose available in the blood to fuel our brain and our kidneys and our different organs and our tissues while we're sleeping and not eating. Blood glucose accounts for approximately 30% of the total energy fuel required by exercising muscles. Now, the remaining fuel that muscle uses is derived from stored muscle glycogen. So again, what is glycogen? That's just like thousands of glucose molecules linked together and stored in muscle. So muscle glycogen is a primary fuel source for intense exercise. And in prolonged intense exercise, blood glucose concentration eventually falls below normal levels because the liver's level of glycogen becomes depleted, while active skeletal muscle continues to uptake and use the available blood glucose. So think about it. When you're exercising, we'll kind of look at the whole process here. Muscles are contracting. Let's say I'm cycling, right? I'm on a bicycle, I'm cycling, I'm using my quadriceps muscles a lot. What energy sources are my muscles going to use as I increase that exercise intensity? It's going to be the stored glycogen, right? And also, depending on the intensity, some fat. At lower intensities, we like to use fat. Higher intensities, the stored muscle glycogen. So that stored muscle glycogen starts to get used up. Then the muscle says, well, hey, if I want to keep contracting and making ATP to fuel the contractions, I'm running low on glycogen, but I can take some of this glucose out of the blood, uptake that. Through glycolysis, the glucose from the blood can be broken down, and we can make ATP to keep fueling the exercise, so I can keep cycling. Also then, the liver says, man, a lot of glucose is leaving the blood and going into the thigh muscles and being uptaken by working muscles. So the liver is going to break down its stored glycogen and release glucose in the blood to maintain the blood glucose level so it doesn't drop too low, because the muscles are uptaking the glucose out of the blood. So the liver is that last line of defense against the blood glucose levels dropping too low. However, if you exercise long enough and you're not supplementing with carbohydrate, as we'll talk about in a bit, the liver's glycogen stores and the amount of glucose it can produce drops off because those liver glycogen stores become depleted with long duration activity, especially over 90 minutes or 2 hours. So then you are going to really struggle to maintain your blood glucose levels if you don't ingest some carbohydrate. All right, so intramuscular glycogen levels of most trained athletes, so if you've been doing a lot of endurance training, are adequate to meet the physical demands of moderate intensity exercise. So that's exercise somewhere between 65 to 80% of VO2 max. Exercise bouts lasting anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, okay? So again, this is just very simply saying that if you're a trained athlete, you should have enough glycogen stored in your muscles to allow you to maintain up to 90 minutes of activity, exercise, as long as it's a low to moderate intensity, okay? A 2-hour bout of intense, all right? So a 2-hour bout of intense aerobic exercise may almost entirely deplete glycogen in the liver and working muscles. So without ingestion of carbohydrate during prolonged exercise, lasting 2 hours, then hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, can quickly ensue after the liver and working muscle glycogen is depleted. Okay, and hypoglycemia is defined as a blood glucose concentration of less than 45 milligrams per deciliter of blood. Hypoglycemia impairs exercise performance and contributes to central nervous system fatigue that's associated with prolonged exercise. All right, this graph shows the effect of exercise intensity on glycogen depletion. So this is a study going back to 1974, okay? So let's see. Mom and Dad would have been graduated high school, 71. So they were out. But yeah, it's a long time ago. Before I was born, right? I was born in the 80s, 81. But this just shows that fatigue during prolonged aerobic exercise is caused primarily by depleted glycogen stores in exercising muscle. All right. So let's look at this graph. On the x-axis, the horizontal axis, you see exercise duration. Each little hash mark or tick is 10 minutes of time. So you have the first one 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, then 40, 50, 60 minutes, 70, 80, 90 minutes, and so on, out to 120 minutes, which would be 2 hours of exercise, long duration activity. On the y-axis, the vertical axis, you see muscle glycogen concentration, all right? Obviously, with exercise of any duration, whether it's 10 minutes out to 120 minutes, 2 hours, once you start exercising, you're going to start depleting muscle glycogen. Those levels are going to start dropping. Now, not only does the duration have an impact on muscle glycogen depletion, I mean, the longer you exercise, the greater the amount of glycogen depletion, but also the intensity. So are you exercising intensely, moderately intense, or low intensity? Okay. So if you exercise for a short duration at a high intensity, say 150% of your VO2 max, this is really high intensity exercise, sprinting, and let's say you're going to do that for 10 minutes, you can see you can really deplete muscle glycogen stores rapidly, okay? Because the rate at which you need to supply carbohydrate, or the rate at which you need to supply energy from carbohydrate, it's going to have to occur very rapidly if you're going to maintain trying to sprint for that long, right? I mean, you're going to have to supply a lot of carbohydrate or break down a lot of carbohydrate and make ATP very rapidly. So it declines rapidly at those higher exercise intensities. If you look at more moderate intensities like 83% of VO2 max, that's moderate to high, or then you go out to 64% of VO2 max, that's a moderate intensity, low to moderate, closer to moderate. But 64 to 83%, that's moderate intensity. You can see that muscle glycogen levels are maintained for longer, 60 minutes to 120 minutes before they're depleted at those different intensities. So again, going back to the point on the previous slide, at that moderate intensity, 64% of VO2 max, you could theoretically you've got enough muscle glycogen to maintain the activity for 120 minutes, okay? But higher intensities are going to deplete it quicker. I've talked about this in a previous episode, but I want to go over it again. So fatigue during prolonged aerobic exercise is caused primarily by depleted glycogen stores in exercising muscle and liver. All right. So what you have on the graph on the right are different energy sources that are used in working muscle. So when we're exercising, our muscle can use the stored glycogen there to make ATP, that's energy. It can use blood glucose to make ATP, energy. It can oxidize and burn fatty acids to make ATP, that energy source. Typically what you see is as muscle glycogen levels decline over the minutes of exercise, and you see where the wall is hit there at about 240 minutes, that's 4 hours of prolonged endurance activity, like say somebody running a marathon. Muscle glycogen levels are depleted, blood glucose levels are dropping, and your body struggles to sustain them because the glycogen stores in the liver have been depleted. And there's an increased reliance there. Really, if your blood glucose is low, the liver glycogen stores are depleted, and muscle glycogen is depleted, really the only fuel source you have available are fatty acids. Now, to derive energy in the form of ATP from fatty acids, it's a very lengthy process. You've got to mobilize the fatty acids from fat cells. They have to travel in the blood bound to albumin. Albumin releases the fatty acid through transporters into muscle. Then carnitine transports the fatty acids inside the muscle cell into the mitochondria. And then the long carbon fatty acid chain has to be chopped up 2 carbons at a time through a process called beta oxidation. Oh my gosh. Then acetyl-CoA gets formed and goes to the mitochondria, go through the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, and finally you make some ATP. That's a long process, and because it's such a long process, you can't exercise very intensely if you're relying heavily on fatty acid oxidation. So your race pace is going to drop, or you may have to just stop exercising or slow to like a walk. With glycogen and glucose, as long as those levels are high, which you see before you hit the wall, those levels are up, you can maintain a higher exercise intensity. But once the muscle glycogen levels deplete and the blood glucose levels drop off when you hit the wall, which you see here occurring in this individual at 240 minutes, you are going to feel some symptoms. So weakness, dizziness, increased perceptions of fatigue, decreased motivation. And this necessitates a reduction in exercise intensity or completely stopping exercise, okay? So how do you prevent this? Well, ensure by eating plenty of carbohydrates each day that your glycogen levels, you have plenty of stored carbohydrate in the form of glycogen before exercise even begins. So you want to have high glycogen levels to start with. Then maintain your blood glucose levels during exercise by eating or drinking carbohydrate-rich substances. So things like sports drinks, could be like Gatorade, or it could be carbohydrate gels or bars, carbohydrate gummies. Or also, you just need to pace yourself appropriately when doing exercise. Maybe not start out running at too fast of a pace so that you don't hit that wall sooner. You might, run at lower intensities. So again, there's several ways to do this to stave off hitting the wall. And typically, runners will hit the wall in a marathon around mile 20, and this is because we have about 2,000 calories of carbohydrate stored in the body on average, meaning we've got 500 grams total stored. Each gram of carbohydrate is equivalent to 4 calories. So that's 2,000 calories. There's 100 grams stored in the liver, 400 grams stored in muscle. So 500 grams of carbohydrate stored. Each gram's 4 calories. That's 2,000 calories total. Let's just say someone's running at a pace where they're burning 100 calories per mile. Now, you could be burning more if you're running at a faster pace. You could be burning maybe less if you're like walking. But let's say you're burning 100 calories per mile, right? And you have 2,000 calories of carbohydrate available stored in the body. Well, if you're burning 100 calories per mile, when you get to mile 20, you could have used up all 2,000 calories of carbohydrate, because that's basically what you have stored, right? So again, just multiply it out. 100 calories of carbohydrate burned per mile, and then you've only got 2,000 available. At mile 20, you could be done and could be hitting the wall. And that's why it's important to in any type of endurance exercise that's going to be prolonged like this, supplement with carbohydrate throughout so you don't hit the wall, you don't have any of these symptoms, and you can keep your exercise intensity up throughout the race. And we'll get into those recommendations in a bit, but we'll go to this next slide. So regardless of muscle glycogen content, fatigue during bouts of high intensity exercise can also result from a buildup of metabolites. So these are just formed from breaking down different substances, different compounds in our muscle cell, okay? So metabolites such as hydrogen ions and organic phosphate can build up. When hydrogen ions build up, there are reductions in intramuscular pH, meaning the muscle gets more acidic. So when the muscle's more acidic and we have a lot of hydrogen ions building up, and this occurs during high intensity exercise, the hydrogen ions impair muscle contraction, and we just can't produce as much force. And when your muscle isn't producing as much force, you're fatigued. Also, inorganic phosphate, this builds up as ATP. Our energy source in muscle gets broken down. Inorganic phosphate can interfere with calcium release and muscle contraction as well, so force production goes down. And anybody that's done high intensity exercise, let's go say you run a bunch of repeated sprints at a high intensity and you have very short rest periods between those sprints. you feel your muscles, your calves, your quads, they start to feel like they're burning. And that's really because of all these hydrogen ions accumulating and your muscles are becoming more acidic, okay? Now, the importance of muscle glycogen stores with respect to exercise performance is more relevant during prolonged, meaning greater than 2 minutes, and intermittent high-intensity exercise bouts. So if you're doing prolonged exercise and or you're doing intermittent exercise intensity bouts, like repeating drills at a high intensity, repeating sprints with very short rest periods, yeah, your glycogen stores are going to be very important. But also during those high intensity exercise bouts, you're going to be building up kind of these metabolic waste products, if you will, like the hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphate, your muscle becoming more acidic. That contributes to reduced force production, reduced intensity of exercise, and fatigue as well. In rest periods between intermittent high intensity exercise bouts, muscle has time to clear or buffer hydrogen ions associated with the breakdown of glycogen. So yes, as we're breaking down glycogen, that stored carbohydrate in muscle, you're going to get some hydrogen ions that accumulate, and that causes the muscle to be more acidic. However, if you have sufficient rest periods between high intensity exercise bouts, you can buffer those, clear them out. Performance of very high intensity, short duration exercise. So let's say exercise that lasts less than 10 seconds, like a 40-yard sprint or a vertical jump or a 1 rep max squat, right? These are all very short duration, high intense activities. Exercise performed in these activities depends primarily on producing energy in the form of ATP from the phosphagen system. So instead of relying heavily on stored muscle glycogen, we produce ATP from the phosphagen system when we do these short duration, high intense activities, like I just mentioned. However, muscle glycogen still may play an important role in these short duration, high intense activities because it can help maintain muscle ATP content over the course of a workout session consisting of many repeated sets of high intensity repetitions, like lifting weights with short rest periods. So although during a set of weight training, like let's say I'm going to do 5 bench presses, that may only last 10 to 15 seconds, probably using a lot of the phosphagen system. I'm using stored phosphocreatine to make ATP. When I'm resting, I still may be turning over and breaking down some glycogen to help maintain muscle ATP levels. And as I go on throughout the rest of my workout and I repeat more and more sets and do more and more exercises, my phosphocreatine levels may decline in that phosphagen system, and I'm going to have to start relying more on muscle glycogen to produce ATP to keep fueling my muscle contractions. So that's where, again, the stored phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate and stored muscle glycogen can become important if you're doing like high volume resistance training, right? You're doing 12, 15, I don't know, some people may do 20 sets of resistance training in a single session. So that's where the muscle glycogen becomes more important as a fuel source. So again, this is to answer the question, how limiting of a factor is muscle glycogen? A big limiting factor during resistance exercise? It's not as big as you would think in comparison to, say, aerobic endurance, prolonged aerobic endurance exercise, okay? It does deplete some, as I mentioned, because we do rely on it when we're doing high volume resistance training. It just doesn't deplete to the same extent as what you would see if you exercise continuously for, say, like 2 hours or 3 hours, right? Like running a marathon. I mean, you never stop. You're continuously having to break down glycogen if you're going to run for 2, 3, 4 hours. Whereas with resistance training, you do a set, you lift a load, short duration, high intensity, you rest for maybe 1, 2, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, depending on the load you lifted. And then you do it again. So it's not continuous, it's intermittent. And therefore, glycogen levels don't drop as much. Okay, so again here, carbohydrates are stored in muscle. We know that as glycogen, as a fuel source for exercise. Muscle glycogen is not much of a limiting factor during resistance exercise because we don't break down as much of it. We only lose about 1/3 during a high volume resistance training workout. So you can see there before exercise, the white bar was the level of glycogen. It only reduced by about 33% after subjects performed 8 sets of 10 reps at 75% of their 1 repetition max on the leg press. And then they repeated another 8 sets of 10 reps at that same intensity on the leg extension. So they did 16 total sets there, 8 on the leg extension, 8 on the leg press for 16 total sets. All right. Those 16 total sets only reduced the levels of glycogen stored in the quadriceps by 33% in this study. So there's still plenty of glycogen if you wanted to do more training. I mean, there's still more there. So muscle glycogen is not likely to become a limiting factor during high volume resistance exercise training sessions. In addition, such high set volume usually requires a low training frequency to allow muscle damage to recover. Therefore, there should be sufficient time to restore any loss of muscle glycogen stores before you do your next workout, because you may not hit those leg muscles again for 2, 3, or 4 days, or maybe a week, depending on the workout that you're doing. So that's plenty of time to be able to restore that 33% that you lost. Whereas a runner, you know, they may go on a long run today, then tomorrow they're doing some, maybe they go on a, shorter high intensity run, and maybe the next day do some fartlek training, but they're running like every day, right? And so it's very important for them to be able to replenish those stores if they're an aerobic endurance athlete. It's like I said, glycogen's important with people that resistance train, and you do use it as a fuel along with phosphocreatine in your muscle cells. It just doesn't reduce to the same extent as what you see in prolonged aerobic endurance exercise. All right, carbohydrate loading. What is this? This is a practice that some aerobic endurance athletes use to significantly increase their muscle glycogen stores before longer duration events. Say events lasting longer than 90 minutes. That would typically lead to depletion of glycogen stores. Okay, so carbohydrate loading promotes storage of glycogen within the muscle and liver that exceeds normal levels. So you're trying to exceed supercompensation. You're trying to pack in and store more glycogen in the muscle cells and liver cells than what you normally would by really bumping up carbohydrate intake in the days leading up to a big endurance event, like a marathon. I keep using that example, okay? The additional glycogen is available then that you've packed in and stored as a result of eating a high carbohydrate diet in the 3 or 4 days leading up to the race. That additional glycogen is available for prolonged endurance exercise, and thus it should help increase performance. You should be able to run at higher intensities. Your time to exhaustion should be prolonged, so it takes longer for you to become exhausted in the race because you have more of this extra carbohydrate available. Of course, there's several different approaches that have been used that I'm going to discuss, and that baby there you can see is definitely carbohydrate loading with some spaghetti. Don't think it's getting ready to run a marathon, though. So let's talk about these several different approaches. A couple approaches have historically been used, and runners may use, and road cyclists, anybody that's doing aerobic endurance activity, triathletes. So there's a not so good method and a better method. The not so good method is that, and this is an older method, aerobic endurance athletes 3 to 4 days prior to the event, their race, would exercise to exhaustion and deplete their levels of liver and muscle glycogen. They would consume low carbohydrate diet, so they wouldn't take in a lot of carbs. So they've dramatically depleted, as a result of the low carb diet and the exhaustive training, the amount of glycogen in the liver and muscles. All right. And then 2 days before the event, they taper off their activity, reduce the training, but they eat a high carbohydrate diet to try to really pack in and store a bunch of carbohydrate as glycogen in the liver and muscles. That's not necessarily the best method. A better method is 3 to 5 days prior to the race, the event that the athlete's preparing for, they reduce their training volume. So 3 to 5 days out, let's say they have a race on Saturday. So maybe on Monday or Wednesday, they're cutting back the training volume. They're not putting in much mileage, or very intense training. They cut that back. They maintain eating 55 to 65% of their daily calories coming from carbohydrate. That's CHO. So about 65% of the calories each day during that tapering period are coming from carbs. And then 2 days prior to the event, so Thursday and Friday leading up to the race on Saturday, they bump the carbohydrate intake up even more. Above 70% of their total daily calories would be coming from carbohydrate in each of those 2 days before the race on Saturday. So what are some of the pros and cons of this carbohydrate loading that triathletes, marathoners, road cyclists, endurance athletes, what's pro and what's con? Added glycogen for endurance. More of it's being stored in the liver and muscles. Another pro is the 3 to 5 day taper in training volume before the event ensures that your body is rested. You need to be well rested if you're going to run a marathon. Additional water stored with glycogen may be beneficial for thermoregulation. So what does that mean? Well, we know that for every gram of glycogen you store in your body, like for every gram of glycogen you store in muscle, you also store 3 grams of water. And having that extra water in the muscle and available to sweat out could help you to keep your core temperature at a normal level when you're exercising and help cool your body. Like if you're going to be running a marathon in a very hot environment, like say out in Arizona or something. Okay, so it can help you by storing additional water. You have more water to be released as sweat and evaporated to cool your body if you're exercising on race day in a hot environment. Cons now. If you're really in the bad way of doing the carb loading where you're really training to exhaustion and then trying to take in a bunch of carbs, it may disrupt your training schedule. It can be difficult to do carb loading for every event, so maybe you just save it for big meets. Here's one con with water. So water can be beneficial for thermoregulation and keeping your body cool when you exercise, but if you pack in a bunch of glycogen into your body, and you're for every gram of glycogen, you store 3 grams of water, it may add weight to you. So you may feel this additional water weight and feel heavier on race day. It may make you feel a little more sluggish and, just like you're just having to, work harder to run, okay? So with carbohydrate loading made simple. So these are kind of current just recommendations, all right? So 3 to 4 days prior to race day. All right. So again, you're going to race on Saturday. So starting on Wednesday or maybe even Tuesday, 3 to 4 days, you can maximize your muscle glycogen stores by eating a minimum of 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight each day. So again, calculate this. How do you figure your body weight in kilograms? Well, first you need to know that 1 kilogram is equal to 2.2 pounds. So if I take my weight in pounds, I weigh 175, and I divide by 2.2, that will give me my weight in kilograms, which I'm 79.55 kilograms. So I'll just round that to 80. So I weigh 80 kilograms. Let's say I was going to run a marathon on Saturday, say starting Tuesday or Wednesday, I would need to ingest, 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight each of those days. So 80 times 10, that's 800 grams of carbohydrate that I would ingest each day. That's a lot of carbohydrate. But again, I'm trying to load my body with carbs so I have plenty of this fuel to get me through that marathon. And then also the 3 to 4 days prior to the marathon, just reduce the training volume, cut it back, and maybe not do anything. You could be maybe active, but you want to be ready and rested for race day. All right. Carb recommendations. I also talked about this in another episode. This is for like your average American, okay? The RDA, recommended dietary allowance for carbohydrates, for most people, this is like 97 to 98% of the population, is to get a minimum of 130 grams a day, okay? Now, 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrate, so that's equivalent to 3 to 5 slices of bread, you need to eat at least that much to prevent your body from going into ketosis, right? So ketosis is a condition where when you're on a very low carbohydrate diet, like you're eating less than 50 grams of carbs a day, your fat cells release a lot of fatty acids. So you're releasing through what's called lipolysis fatty acids from the fat cells. There's this big influx of fatty acids to the liver, and your liver converts a bunch of those to ketones. And then those ketones are dumped back into the blood, and you can use the ketones as a source of fuel in the brain, the heart, the muscle cells. And those ketones are a vital fuel source because you're not eating carbohydrate, so you're not eating very much of that. So you don't have as much carbohydrate available to fuel your body. So your body turns to producing these ketones from fatty acids. All right. Food and Nutrition Board recommends carbohydrate intake should range from 45% to 65% of your total daily calorie intake. Now, it's not like you have to be in this range. I mean, it's just, this is what's going to probably feel best for most people. Some people on a ketogenic diet, less than 5% of their total daily calories are coming from carbs, and 75% are coming from fat. And some people do well on that. Some people can adhere to it, others can't. But most people, this is a good general recommendation. Of the total amount of calories you eat each day, 45 to 65% come from carbs, okay? So how do you figure this? Here's an example. If you eat 2,000 total calories per day, how many grams of carbohydrate should you eat per day to stay within that 45 to 65% range? It's important to remember that 1 gram of carbohydrate is equal to 4 calories of energy. So if you take 45%, 0.45, and multiply that by the 2,000 calories that you're eating each day to, say, maintain your body weight, there's 900 calories there that are from carbohydrate. And you would need to divide those 900 calories by 4 calories per gram, and that gives you 225 grams of carbohydrate that you should ingest, so that 45% of your calories each day are coming from carbs if you're on a 2,000 total calorie per day diet, okay? Now, if you're on the upper end there, 65%, 0.65 times 2,000 total calories eaten per day, 1,300 calories coming from carbohydrates divided by 4 calories per gram, you would need to consume 325 grams of carbohydrates if you're on a 2,000 total calorie per day diet. And that 325 grams reflects that 65% of your calories are coming from carbohydrate on that 2,000 total calorie per day diet. Now, many Americans we know are sedentary, struggling with their weight. I think it's right now up to 75% of Americans are overweight or obese. And so we're not burning a lot of carbs. We're not burning a lot of fat because we're not moving much and we're overeating. We're in a caloric surplus. We're eating too many calories from carbs, too many calories from fats. And if you look at a lot of the foods in the American diet, they're high in both. So donuts, high in carbs, high in fat. Ice cream, high in carbs, high in fat. Cheeseburger, same thing. French fries, right? So we're in this caloric surplus, eating a lot of foods high in carbs and fats. And then we're not moving around a lot through the day, burning carbs and fats. So we're accumulating and storing fat. So I'd say most Americans probably should be at the lower end of the range of carbohydrate recommendations, maybe around 45% if they're not that active. I'm not saying you have to go anti-carb or no carb at all, but lowering your carbohydrate intake can help. And part of this is because high carbohydrate diets, especially once you go above 65% of your total daily calories coming from carbs, promote the features of atherogenic dyslipidemia, such as elevated triglycerides and lower high-density lipoprotein cholesterol. So what does that mean? Well, if you really are taking in a lot of carbs each day and you're not burning them, above 65% of your total daily calories are coming from carbs, you can convert a lot of those to triglycerides in the liver, and then your blood levels of triglycerides go up, and also your LDL levels of cholesterol may increase, and high levels of triglycerides and LDL cholesterol may increase the risk of forming atherosclerotic plaques. So that's your atherogenic dyslipidemia. So if you form atherosclerotic plaques that have cholesterol and fat embedded in them, those form in your blood vessel walls, and then they can impair blood flow to, say, the heart and the brain. if it's happening in the peripheral vasculature, even down to like the legs. So blood flow gets impaired to some of your vital organs and vital tissues of the body. High carbohydrate diets also tend to lower what's called high density lipoprotein cholesterol. So high density lipoprotein is this carrier that carries excess cholesterol away from the blood vessels and the peripheral cells back to the liver so it can be broken down. So a healthy person is going to have high levels of high density HDL cholesterol. That's a good thing because the high density lipoprotein, high HDL, you have a bunch of those vehicles to take cholesterol back to the liver and break it down. But if you're taking in a lot of carbohydrates, a high carbohydrate diet, that tends to lower your high density lipoprotein, HDL cholesterol levels, and that's a bad thing, okay? Now, athletes, they may benefit and can benefit, especially aerobic endurance athletes, from consuming more carbohydrate each day to fuel training and performance. Now, you have to look at what type of athlete's in front of you. Is it an aerobic endurance athlete, like a distance runner, a road cyclist, a triathlete, who trains greater than 90 minutes per day? If so, they should ingest or consume 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. The reason for this, why they need to consume so much carbohydrate, much more than your average sedentary American, is because a 2-hour bout of intense aerobic exercise may almost entirely deplete glycogen in the liver and working muscles. 8 to 10 grams per kilogram, or 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight should help to replenish the skeletal muscle glycogen levels that are depleted within 24 hours after exercise, right? So aerobic endurance athletes that are engaging in prolonged exercise, they significantly deplete their skeletal muscle glycogen and liver glycogen. But by ingesting 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight per day, they can replenish the muscle glycogen they've burned during an exercise bout within 24 hours, which will allow them to be prepared and fueled for the next day of training, right? Now, 5 to 6 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight is recommended for anaerobic athletes. So those individuals that are participating in strength training, maybe they're sprinters, doing skill exercises like, football practice, basketball practice. You don't need as much carbohydrate because that activity is more intermittent and not as continuous. There's going to be rest between football plays, huddle up. Basketball, there's periods where you rest when someone's shooting a free throw, or maybe you get subbed out of the game. So resistance training, you do a set, you rest. So you don't need as much carbohydrate to fuel performance in those activities. And it's been shown only a 24 to 40% depletion, somewhere in that range, of skeletal muscle glycogen occurs when performing 1 hour of high-intensity strength training. So not as much carbohydrate is needed daily to provide fuel for that type of activity and to produce the ATP you need to do it. Just like I showed a couple slides back, you saw that graph in the green bar in that study of strength training where subjects performed 16 sets of leg exercises. There was only a 33% drop in muscle glycogen. So that's, depleted, but not significantly like you would see in an aerobic endurance athlete that exercises continuously for 90 minutes or 2 hours. All right. So carbohydrate recommendations before exercise. Let's get into this. So generally consuming 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight each day maximizes glycogen stores in athletes. And this is important for aerobic endurance athletes. Remember, if you're a strength training athlete, an anaerobic athlete, you can get away with less, maybe like 5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. 3 to 4 hours before exercise, eat a carbohydrate-rich meal. So about 200 to 300 grams of carbs to increase performance, work output, or both in that subsequent exercise bout. Okay, so again, give yourself 3 to 4 hours, right? You don't want to be trying to digest the food while you're also trying to run, right? You don't want to eat 30 minutes before that race, a big meal, because then your body's trying to direct blood flow to the gastrointestinal tract to digest the meal, but you also need blood and nutrients going to the muscle, so it's just a mess. So give yourself 3 to 4 hours, eat that meal, and 3 to 4 hours later, then you participate in your activity. Athletes should ingest up to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight 3 to 4 hours before aerobic endurance exercise or competition. Or if you don't go by that up to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight, like I said, just eat 200 to 300 grams in a meal 3 to 4 hours before exercise. Certain carbohydrate sources like fructose, if you eat a meal that's high in fructose, may cause gastrointestinal upset. So may upset your stomach. You don't want that occurring. When combined with a regular resistance training program, ingestion of combination of carbohydrate and protein or amino acids before and after training has been shown to lead to improvements in muscle strength, power, body weight, lean muscle mass, and intramuscular markers of muscle growth. So it seems like with resistance training, there's a benefit there somewhat to the ingestion of combination of carbs and protein before and after training. For exercise or events that last greater than 60 minutes, this is during exercise, right? Consume 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, right? So if you're an endurance athlete, you're going to be running, a marathon that's going to last longer than 60 minutes. You've got to be consuming some carbohydrate each hour to keep fueling you through that prolonged activity. Now, if you're running a 5K, that's only 3.1 miles, or maybe even a 10K, which is 6.2 miles, depending on the pace you're running that at. It's probably going to last less than 60 minutes. Supplementing with carbohydrate during that 5K or 10K is probably not needed, assuming that you had adequate amounts of carbohydrate consumed each day leading up to the event or had a good meal of carbs before the event. You probably don't need any during the race, right? Because it just doesn't last long enough. But if you're running a half marathon, a marathon, that's where it becomes more important for carbohydrate during the event. So again, consume 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. This can be done using gels, gummies, or sports drinks. Carbohydrate gels and gummies, anytime you're taking those, you really need to ingest and you need to drink water with those because those are concentrated sources of carbohydrate. So if you ingest a gel or gummy during exercise, it's very concentrated, and when that carbohydrate gets into the small intestine, it's going to want to pull water into the intestine because it's so concentrated, and that could give you the old jogger's trots, some diarrhea, upset stomach, and you don't want that. And there are images, you can see them online, and you may have seen them if you're a runner, of someone that has literally crapped all over themselves in a race. And not only does the high concentration of carbohydrates, but the running, just the motion of running and jostling the gastrointestinal tract and the organs, that can upset the stomach. But what you do is, if you're taking in carbohydrate gels or gummies, you drink water with it to dilute the concentration of carbohydrate that's entering the small intestine. By diluting that concentration of carbohydrate that's in the small intestine, it shouldn't cause the GI distress and upset stomach and discomfort that you would see if you just were ingesting gels and gummies without much water intake with them. Okay. So the best method overall here during exercise is to use sports drinks. So drink 1 to 2 cups. So that's 8 to 16 ounces of a 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution every 10 to 15 minutes when you're engaging in exercise that lasts longer than 60 minutes. Okay. So again, just to go through that again, drink 1 to 2 cups of a solution that contains 6 to 8 grams of carbohydrate per 100 milliliters of fluid. So that's a 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution, and ingest that every 10 to 15 minutes, right? You don't want to ingest it every 10 to 15 minutes, again, so you don't get gastrointestinal upset by taking in the carbohydrate, okay? Plus, you don't want to feel waterlogged and heavy. You don't want to drink, 32 ounces at once. It's like, just take in little bits every 10 to 15 minutes as you are partaking in that marathon, and that's going to help keep those carbohydrate and blood glucose levels stable, okay? That percentage also is important, 6 to 8% carbohydrate in the solution. That percentage, because it allows for rapid absorption into the blood, okay? From the small intestine, it gets into the blood much more quickly, much faster. And once that carbohydrate gets into the blood, it's going to be off to your working muscles and available as a fuel source. Also, mixing different forms of carbohydrate lengthens fuel supply, increases muscle carbohydrate oxidation, and improves performance. So glucose, fructose, sucrose, those are all different carbohydrates, and maltodextrin as well can be used in combination, but large amounts of fructose may cause gastrointestinal problems and GI upset. So again, be wary of if the carbohydrate source has a lot of fructose in it, okay? Ingesting carbohydrate alone or in combination with protein during resistance exercise can increase muscle glycogen stores and facilitate greater training adaptations after acute and prolonged periods of resistance training. So a lot of these recommendations for carbohydrate I've really hammered home for endurance athletes because of the continuous nature of that exercise and the amount of glycogen depletion that can occur with continuous exercise. But I still throw in some of these recommendations for those of you that are doing resistance training, strength training, because although you don't deplete your glycogen and carbohydrate levels to the same extent in the body, it still plays a role in resistance training and anaerobic type exercise. So this chart just shows changes in blood glucose and ongoing performance with the supplementation of carbohydrates during exercise. So this is just trying to hammer home the point of why carbohydrates are so important, and you need to supplement with them if you're engaging in exercise that lasts continuously for over an hour, right? Continuously for over an hour. So aerobic endurance exercise. So you see duration of exercise in hours along the bottom from time 0 to 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, increasing as you go from left to right. And then the blood glucose concentration from low to high on the vertical axis, right? Well, with no carbohydrate supplementation during exercise out to 3 hours, what do you see? A pretty steady drop in blood glucose, right? Because you're not supplying any carbs to replenish your blood glucose during that time frame. However, the red line, you see that by supplying carbohydrates throughout the duration of the endurance exercise, it prolongs the amount of time that you can continuously exercise. So by supplementing with carbohydrate during aerobic exercise, you see that this individual is able to train for an hour longer, right? Go from 3 hours out to 4 hours, right? So again, a prolonged period of time that you can exercise and a prolonged period to where you reach a point of exhaustion, okay? Now, carbohydrate recommendations after exercise. So after endurance exercise, again, this is continuous activity, consume 1.5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight within 30 minutes of completing exercise, followed by 0.6 to up to a gram of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight every 2 hours after exercise for the next 4 to 6 hours, right? So you're really trying to get a bunch of carbohydrate back in to replace what you've burned, okay? Replace those glycogen stores, replace that lost liver and muscle glycogen, okay? Ingesting amino acids, especially the essential amino acids, immediately after exercise until 3 hours post-exercise can help stimulate sharp increases in protein synthesis. So again, maybe you have some carbohydrates after exercise, essential amino acids, you can get a bunch of those in like whey protein, so a whey protein supplement. So that combination can help stimulate protein synthesis after exercise. Maximal improvements in muscle strength, body composition during resistance training over several weeks can be achieved by ingestion of a combination of carbohydrate and protein after exercise. Adding carbohydrate to protein, however, may not be necessary to promote maximal muscle hypertrophy of skeletal muscle, right? Definitely protein is important. I talk about that in other videos. definitely need adequate protein intake throughout the day to maximize muscle hypertrophy. But there could be some benefit with adding carbohydrate. Also, the addition of 5 grams of creatine to a carbohydrate and protein supplement may facilitate even greater adaptations to resistance training. So I'm a big advocate of creatine, especially if you're doing any type of anaerobic exercise, whether it's resistance training, you're a sprinter, football player, volleyball player, any type of anaerobic activity. All right, the optimum time of carbohydrate consumption after exercise. So again, continuing on with talking about why it's important to consume a lot of carbohydrate after you exercise, especially if you're an aerobic endurance athlete doing continuous activity. Well, there's an enzyme called glycogen synthase, and I have this in red because in my exercise biochemistry class, in any of the lectures, I always show enzymes in red. So glycogen synthase, the levels of it and the activity of it are very high in the first 15 minutes out to 14 hours after exercise. Okay, so after you exercise from 15 minutes to 14 hours, glycogen synthase, enzyme levels are high and it's really active. What does glycogen synthase do? Well, it helps to synthesize or make glycogen in your liver and in your muscles, right? What do we make glycogen from? Glucose. Where do we get glucose from? The diet, right? Eating carbohydrates, rice, pasta, potatoes, okay? So remember, exercise that's continuous and prolonged uses a lot of glycogen. Carbohydrate must be consumed from the diet when glycogen synthase levels are elevated and it's very active to help speed up the resynthesis of glycogen in your liver and muscles. This graph just shows that basically your glycogen synthase activity and muscle glycogen, okay? So you see there in blue at the very bottom, in that little rectangle, you see you have your race, your marathon, right? 26.2 miles of running, that's exhausting. What happens during that race? Well, if you look at the red line, glycogen synthase activity is increasing during that race as your glycogen levels are depleting though, okay? So glycogen levels are depleting, but your body's trying to basically synthesize, or your body's going to have more glycogen synthase that's being translated in your cells, so that as the glycogen levels drop to a low point, you have more glycogen synthase enzyme ready to go. You have it being more active. And then in the days after the marathon, you should immediately after the race, when that glycogen synthase activity is high, consume a lot of carbohydrates because its activity is going to drop off once you get, remember, it's high from 15 minutes to 14 hours after exercise, but then in the days after that, its activity drops off. So you really need to take advantage of the high glycogen synthase activity right after the race, where it's peaking when your glycogen stores are low, because that glycogen synthase accelerated activity is going to help you rebuild glycogen in your liver and muscles at a much greater rate, assuming that you're taking in a lot of carbohydrate right after the race. So, aerobic endurance athletes, don't delay eating carbs after you exercise, after you train, after a big race. Eating carbohydrates soon after exercise will result in faster glycogen synthesis, and this is partly due to the activity of that glycogen synthase. Its activity is going to be up right after that race. So again, eating carbohydrates soon after exercise, you're going to generate or resynthesize, replenish glycogen at a faster rate than delaying it by 2 hours, right? So don't wait. And if you look at this graph on the right, just shows that glycogen resynthesis or replenishment of glycogen in the liver and muscle can be higher in the first 2 hours after exercise, but only with a carbohydrate feeding. So be ready to eat after you run that race, after you run that marathon, right? Don't delay it. If you wait until 2 hours after the race, and then you see the orange down arrow, right? There's a delay, 2 hours after the race, and then you eat where that arrow is. yeah, you're going to replenish some glycogen because you're ingesting carbohydrates, but the overall level of glycogen that you're able to replenish in your muscles and liver is going to be much lower, about half of what it would be if you ingested carbohydrates at time 0, right as the race ended. Okay? So don't wait. Replenish those glycogen stores. And, because you may want to engage in some training sessions that next week, and it's important to start replenishing those glycogen stores as early as you can. So muscle glycogen can be fully restored in a day, assuming you're taking in adequate carbohydrates, right? So muscle glycogen, as we've hammered home, is an important fuel for prolonged moderate to high intensity exercise, and we store muscle glycogen. That's the storage form of carbohydrate in muscle in the liver. We know that. Depleted muscle glycogen stores following cycling, in this study, going back to 1995, it was shown that when cyclists depleted their muscle glycogen stores, they could be fully restored in a day as long as they were consuming a high carbohydrate diet. So again, take in that 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day. Keep that carbohydrate intake high, and you're for sure going to be able to replenish those glycogen stores within a day, even if you fully depleted them during the previous exercise bout. The other reason a high carbohydrate diet is important, and I've talked about this a little bit already, is that by consuming a high amount of carbohydrate each day, you will ensure adequate glycogen availability for subsequent training sessions. All right? So on this graph, the y-axis is the muscle glycogen content. The x-axis, horizontal axis, is different time points. So 0, 12, 24 hours, 36 hours, 48, all the way out to 72 hours, which would be 3 days. All right. And then you see the black arrows with training bouts. So this is where somebody is engaging, an aerobic endurance athlete, in 2-hour training bouts. So they're engaging in one at 24 hours, another 2-hour training bout at 48 hours. Well, if you're going to be engaging in 2-hour training bouts, one at 24 hours, then another at 48 hours, you're going to be needing to replenish glycogen stores pretty rapidly training each day, because a 2-hour bout of training is going to significantly reduce glycogen in the liver and muscles. So let's look at the differences in somebody that's going to do training bouts at 24, 48, and so on hours, if they're consuming a low carbohydrate diet versus a high carbohydrate diet. Well, the low carbohydrate diet, you see that in the red line with the open circles, their muscle glycogen levels drop. The first training bout at time 0, they drop down from 120 to 60, so they're about half. And then they eat a low carbohydrate diet. And then at 24 hours, they're starting with half of what they started with on the first day of training. So they do another 2-hour bout at that 24-hour time point, and they go from a muscle glycogen level of what is that, about 60 or 70, down to 30. All right. And then they stay on that low carb diet. They're not replenishing glycogen stores. And then the next day at 48 hours, they are going to do another 2 hours of exercise, and they go and drop it down even lower, down to about 10. All right. So you can't sustain that, right? That's not sustainable because you're not replenishing your glycogen stores adequately. You're not going to be able to keep doing those 2-hour training sessions, right? If you look at somebody on the high carbohydrate diet, though, yeah, on the first day, day 0, they do a 2-hour training bout. Their glycogen stores drop to about the same level as the person on the low carbohydrate diet. However, because they consume a lot of carbohydrates after exercise, and they're eating probably 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day, over that 24-hour period leading into the next exercise training bout, they almost fully replenish their glycogen stores. And then they're back up to that kind of peak level at the 24-hour time point. Then they're going to train for 2 hours. They drop back down to 60. They eat a high carbohydrate diet the whole next day. They get their levels back up. At the 48-hour time point, they do another 2 hours of training. And you just see it. They're able to each day replenish their glycogen stores by eating a high carbohydrate diet, so they're adequately fueled for the next day's training session. Okay, so that's important. That's where, people ask me all the time, should I eat carbs? Should I not eat carbs? Hey, find a diet that works for you and you could adhere to and stick with long term. And find the diet, obviously if you want to lose weight, you got to be in a caloric deficit. If you want to gain weight, you need to be in a caloric surplus. But find a diet you can stick with to achieve your goal. Most Americans, I'd say, they should probably lower both their carb and fat intake. They're not training 2 hours every day. They're not training 90 minutes or 60 minutes even. So they're not really dramatically reducing glycogen levels in the body, right? So they can take in less carbs. And you could also go on a lower carbohydrate diet. I mean, you definitely are going to burn a lot of fat doing that, if that's one of your major goals, but it may impair your ability to perform high intensity exercise. So your training may be taking a hit. You may not be able to train as hard, and you may not feel as good, or maybe you do. Some people adjust to them well. So I don't have a problem with low carb diets. It's just finding what you can adhere to. But again, carbohydrates are important for sustaining exercise intensity and for prolonged endurance exercise. Okay, so this is where with athletes, if an athlete comes to me and asks, should I take in carbs? The answer is, yeah, if you're an aerobic endurance athlete, you really need them to maintain long bouts of exercise and to maintain certain levels of intensity. So carbohydrates are important for athletes. Thanks for watching this episode of Fitness Facts. Hope you gained some knowledge about carbohydrates and exercise. If you have questions for me about the KU Exercise Science Program, you can email me at jtaylor@ku.edu or call my office phone, 913-897-8516. I had to think about it. I don't use my phone that much. So again, it's 913-897-8516. That's my office phone. Thanks for watching.